I'm Tom Clark. Welcome back to Power Play. And let's go back to look at these environmental regulations, but through a slightly different prism, because it begs the question, what sort of discussion could this sort of thing open up in the future? With our economies so linked together and now increasingly government regulations being harmonized, where could all of this go? To have this discussion, I'm joined from Washington by Chris Sands of the Hudson Institute. He is a specialist in Canada-U.S. relations and especially in North American economic integration. And here in Ottawa by Michael Kurgan, who is the former Canadian ambassador to Washington. Welcome to you both. Thanks very much for being here. Can I just start off with a simple question to both of you? And it is this: if we can harmonize regulations when it comes to tailpipe emissions, why can't we, or why shouldn't we, harmonize all sorts of other things, whether it be security, whether it be immigration, anything that concerns North America? In other words, why stop here? And Chris, let me throw it to you first.
Well, I think actually the opportunity this provided was lead time. You know, when you have a new regulation and you consult between Canadian officials and American officials before you bring in the regulation, and you have a nice process where everyone has a chance to weigh in, it's a lot easier to get your regulations harmonized. We're dealing with what really are decades of regulations that have piled up in some of the other sectors you mentioned, which we still have to clear out. But with new things, I think we're off to a good start with this attempt to harmonize the regulation.
And Michael, what about from your perspective? I mean, could this be the beginning of something, or do you see this in isolation?
Well, Tom, I think a lot of it has to do with how politically popular harmonization is. One of your previous guests talked about if we can harmonize up, that is to say, improve our environmental regulations by integrating our regulatory authorities on environment with the United States if they're ahead of us. That's probably a reasonably popular thing to do in Canada. If you're going to move to security issues where there may be interest of creating a perimeter approach where we have the same regulations regarding who can come into the country, under what criteria, et cetera, this may be slightly less popular in Canada. So I think a lot of it has to do, Chris did talk a bit about preparation, extremely important when you're talking about labeling things, labeling and food safety and product safety. But on some of the issues like security, much more politically controversial, and there may be less appetite for that in Canada.
I guess, and while this is from a Canadian perspective, Chris, I'd like you to start with this, that as long as we are harmonizing increasingly regulations, you know, on the environment, tailpipe emissions, soon it's going to be on airplanes and boats and all sorts of other things going on. Should there be a Canadian ask out of all of this? In other words, what are we getting out of the fact that we're harmonizing with you? And let's not kid ourselves, Canada's not the tail wagging the dog in this case. We're signing on to what essentially are regulations worked out in Washington. But, you know, our request always is, can you find a way of thinning that border out instead of thickening it? And yet, while we're merging our regulations, it doesn't seem as if we're getting our major agenda item on the table at all. Or is that unrealistic to think that we could?
Well, I think there's a third actor here, and that's the industry itself, highly integrated between Canada and the U.S. The automotive industry employs lots of Canadians, lots of Americans, and is on hard times right now. And one thing that you heard from the major automakers as the EPA in the United States, working with the Department of Transportation, talked about going in this direction was, please give us as much as possible a single standard across Canada, the U.S., so that we have one sort of technological benchmark for all of our vehicles, because then they can build one car and sell it in both places, or at least in as many places as possible, and that's good for the economy. Here, Canada was really responding, I think, to Canadian industry, the Canadian auto industry, saying we need to make sure that our regulations aren't too far apart from the Americans. And in that process, played catch-up a little bit with an American process that had already launched, but we were able to work it out so that the standards are the same. But I think that the question of an ask, although sometimes appropriate here, there wasn't a real way to ask anything. Canada was just trying to make sure we weren't at a disadvantage in terms of Canadian auto plants working in a larger North American industry.
Michael, let me pick up on a point that you made in your last answer when you were saying, you know, environmental regulations may be politically popular, but things like security, immigration, and so on may not be as politically popular, and therefore a tougher thing to do. But, you know, I think back to the free trade agreement. It wasn't necessarily a popular thing in this country, but ultimately people felt it was the right thing to do if you're looking at the future of the North American continent. So I come back to it. Do you think that there's any room in the discussion, even in the near term or the midterm, for politicians to sit down and say, we've got to reinvent North America, and if we started with environmental regulations, can that bloom into something else, or is that just off the table as far as you're concerned?
No, Tom, I think absolutely. I mean, I think there's a certain momentum that develops here and a certain trust and a certain recognition that we are moving over years, and it is years. I mean, these things do take time. That we can move to a more integrated system. Part of the problem we have is we have two sort of constitutional differences. We have the Charter of Rights, which obviously the regime that governs our jurisprudence and how we deal with human rights issues, immigration questions, these sorts of issues, whereas the United States have a slightly different system. So there are some rather difficult legal issues given our different legal systems, constitutional systems, that are tough to work out. Having said that, on food and product safety issues, very often the differences are strictly bureaucratic. And both countries have more or less the same standards of wishing to try and protect their populations against infectious diseases or in bad products coming in from China, etc. These are areas where we can probably work together and over time surmount some of these, the tyranny of small differences as we call it, and move to a much more flexible, a much more fluid, and a much more integrated system to the benefit of both countries.
Tom, Chris, this is one of the things... I was just going to jump in and say, I think that the challenge here is that these regulations may be popular in terms of their goals, but they may not be very popular in implementation. The attempt here is to move away from the old fuel economy standards to a new approach that regulates the emissions as though they were greenhouse gases, consistent with what the U.S. EPA has been threatening to do, treating this as a pollutant harmful to human health. If we move in this direction, they're talking about the total cost of implementing this rule in the U.S. being about $52 billion in an economy that's still recovering. It's true, the average consumer will probably spend another $1,000 on a vehicle that meets these standards, and it'll take a while before we see any real impact, because it'll take a while before new vehicles make their way through the fleet and become the majority. So with benefits down the road, with costs up front, and a big hit to the U.S. economy, these regulations may not be very popular in the U.S. Canada may find that although they share the goals of trying to limit greenhouse gases, they may not like the way this rule is designed and implemented either. And so it'll raise an important question for us. Although the two governments have colluded here in a popular sort of purpose, have they created something that our publics will actually, in the end of the day, like? And Canada may want to walk away, or maybe the U.S. will later down the road.
Yeah, I think this is really important stuff, and it's a great conversation, and I thank you both for helping to kick it off. Michael Kurgan in Ottawa and Chris Sands, a senior fellow with the Hudson Institute in Washington. Thank you both very much, and have a great long weekend, by the way.
All right.
Thank you.
We're going to be back with...